So to begin talking about globalization, we want to ask the question why, right? Why have we seen so much globalization? And in some sense, it's important to stress how natural globalization is, in the sense that from the beginnings, the earliest beginnings of human history, people have migrated, right? They migrated out of East Africa into other parts of Africa, then of course across the entire planet. For much of this history, trade was a factor, right? The desire to get something from someplace else that you couldn't get, or that you couldn't get cheaply where you were. Or in other words, the lure of comparative advantage. So think about Marco Polo going to China, right? Or what then became called the Silk Road, in which goods from East Asia and Europe were exchanged along the Silk Road. Or think about the early European explorers going to what is today Indonesia, what at the time were called the Spice Islands, because this was a place where you could get all kinds of spices that were either unavailable or incredibly expensive in Europe. So trade has always been a big aspect of globalization. Over time, the key technologies have changed, but technology has always been an important part of globalization. The great age of exploration that leads then to the great era of European colonialism is driven in large part by improvements in astronomy and navigation, as well as improvements in the construction of sailing ships. Later, in the 19th century, there's a good case to be made that the development of the telegraph in the 19th century has, in terms of the speed of communications, compared to what was there before it, actually might have had a bigger impact than the development of the internet today. It took communication over long distances from weeks down to seconds. Cheaper shipping. Shipping has gotten less expensive over time as ships have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, as container handling methods have been improved. We see this, of course, all over the Inland Empire. And as even shipping things by air has gotten cheaper. And lastly, but probably most important in this most recent generation of globalization, has been improvements of information technology. And that's been really crucial in terms of keeping track of goods moving all over the world, but also in the fact that now so much of the economy in the world is not in goods at all, right? It's in services, in knowledge, and in finance, which in many cases, right, global financial transactions can be done instantaneously and with a great deal of knowledge about what's going on elsewhere in the world because of information technology. So technology has been a big, important driver. From the perspective of liberalism, and we talked about the theory of comparative advantage, globalization happens because it makes us all richer. It's a normal, natural process, and the only real limits on it are technological and political. Right? From the liberal perspective, eventually you could imagine a single, seamless global marketplace, and for liberals, that would be certainly the most efficient economically, would probably, liberals believe, lead to the most economic equality, and they would also contend it would be desirable politically. But when political will recedes, as it has sometimes in history, we would expect to see then perhaps some step back in globalization, as we did in particular after World War I. But when technological limits recede, when political limits recede, naturally the liberals say trade and finance are going to expand. Economic structuralism has a very different perspective on this. To economic structuralism, unsurprisingly, globalization is a consequence of global capitalism. In many important respects, this understanding of what's happened and what drives it does not really disagree with the liberal explanation. And in fact, Marx was a big proponent of more and more and more international trade because he saw it leading inevitably to greater industrialization and efficiency, which he actually thought was a great thing. He thought that brought progress, and in that sense, he was quite like the liberals. But of course, economic structuralism sees globalization as driven by economic power and therefore being carried out in the interests of capitalism and of the wealthy, and therefore resulting not in greater equality, but in greater inequality, right? And from this perspective, globalization happens in part because global capital mobility and global trade give capital more power over states who might limit them and over workers who might want to try to push for more rights, better wages, and so on. Realism also sees globalization as the exertion of power, and when we get to free trade and global trade relations is where hegemonic stability theory, one of the variants of realism we talked about, really makes its case. Hegemonic stability theorists argue that the hegemon organizes economics according to its interests, that it creates a trading system that benefits its companies and therefore its national wealth. In other words, the argument is that because the hegemon has the strongest economy, it's going to want free trade because free trade is going to benefit it the most. So when does free trade increase then? Well, from the realist hegemonic stability perspective, free trade increases when hegemony is most evident. So the British period, the period of British hegemony in the 19th century saw a huge increase in global trade, largely because Britain was the wealthiest country in the world and it reduced its tariffs. It welcomed imports because it saw the ways in which that was going to make Britain wealthier. Similarly, U.S. hegemony post-World War II, the U.S. welcomed a global trading system because nobody was going to benefit more from global trade than the U.S. and, of course, American multinational corporations, Ford, General Motors, Coca-Cola, and so on. To the extent that we think this approach is correct, we would ask ourselves, what does this predict then for the foreseeable future in an era in which it looks like U.S. hegemony may be receding? Constructivism, as you might expect, focuses on what people think about free trade and globalization. In particular, then looking at how, as states and as the world community redefines its interests and redefines state goals, that this is going to shape trade policy. So looking at the expansion of trade in the 19th century, led by Britain, and the 20th century, led by the U.S., they're not going to look so much at the material interests of the British and the Americans, but rather at the rise of ideology before, sort of in the era leading up to World War I, then its collapse in the era between World War I and World War II, and then the return of that ideology post-World War II. Post-Cold War, constructivists would focus on what's often called the Washington Consensus about the benefits of open borders, free trade, and what some would call neoliberalism as the best way to run global economics. So one of the things to ask from this perspective is the global consensus about the benefits of free trade and the benefits of globalization eroded? And if it does, what would we expect to happen? Now, the last of our 5 schools of thought is feminism. So what does feminism say about this question of why globalization? I'm not sure it does, to be honest with you. I don't think feminine really sees itself as explaining economic and trade phenomena. Feminism will have a great deal to say, right, about the consequences of globalization and where they might be good and where they might be bad, and would raise this question of, well, how does it shape the lives of women and what role do women play in it? But I'm not sure feminism per se has an answer to the question of why globalization. So I just want to be clear about that. All right, so what will go on in our subsequent videos on this topic is really talk about what some of the consequences of globalization are, both good and bad.